On a freezing Colorado night in 1873, a lonely widow heard something crash against her fence, something heavy, human. When she stepped outside, she found a wounded Apache warrior bleeding in the dirt. Helping him meant death if the townsfolk found out. But she dragged him inside anyway. By sunrise, 3 riders were already on her trail. And what began as an act of mercy would soon expose a secret so dark, it could burn the entire town to the ground. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The sound came just after midnight. A wet, heavy thud against the split-rail fence, then nothing but the wind through the cottonwoods. Sarah Bennett froze at her cabin door, lamp trembling in her hand. 2 years alone on this Colorado homestead had taught her to read the frontier's dangers. The difference between a coyote's cry and a man's last breath, between a branch snapping and a rifle being cocked. This was neither. This was something falling. She should have bolted the door, should have doused the light and prayed whatever darkness had arrived would pass her by. Instead, she stepped into the cold October night, her late husband's hunting coat pulled tight over her nightdress. The man lay crumpled near the fence line, one arm twisted beneath him, the other clutching his chest where blood, black in the moonlight, soaked through buckskin and pooled in the dust. Apache, she knew instantly. The beadwork, the high moccasins, the way his long hair was tied back with red cloth. A militia bullet had torn through his ribs. She could see the entry wound still weeping. He wasn't dead. Not yet. His chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate pulls. Sarah knelt beside him, her mind screaming 2 words. Leave him. The settlement was 3 miles east. They'd hanged a man last spring for trading with Apaches. What would they do to a widow who harbored one? But his eyes opened, dark, pain-flooded, human, and met hers. What she didn't know was that 3 riders had already seen the blood trail leading to her door. Sarah hooked her arms beneath his shoulders and pulled. He was lighter than she'd expected, wasted by blood loss and days on the run. Her boots scraped through dust and stone as she dragged him toward the cabin, his heels carving twin lines behind them. On the eastern horizon, barely visible through the trees, torchlight flickered. Voices carried on the wind. She hauled him over the threshold and kicked the door shut. Sarah had buried her husband Thomas in the spring of 1873, when the fever took him in less than a week. The settlement had expected her to sell the homestead and return east, to family she no longer had. Instead, she'd stayed, plowed the fields herself that first season, learned to fire Thomas's rifle without flinching, and kept the cabin standing through 2 hard winters. The other settlers, mostly men who'd offered to help manage her land, had grown cold when she refused. They called her stubborn, unnatural. A woman alone was either a burden or a threat, and Sarah Bennett had made it clear she would be neither. So when the wounded Apache appeared at her fence, she knew what bringing him inside would cost her. The last shred of tolerance the settlement afforded her would vanish the moment they learned. She cleaned the wound by candlelight, her hand steady despite the hammering of her heart. The bullet had passed through, missing the lung by a mercy of inches. She packed the entry and exit with yarrow and comfrey, the way Thomas had shown her, and wrapped his chest tight with torn bedding. For 3 days, he drifted in and out of fever. She spooned broth into his mouth when he could swallow, wiped the sweat from his brow when he couldn't. He never cried out. Even in delirium, he remained silent, watchful. On the 2nd night, he spoke. A single word in Spanish, gracias, she nodded. He tried again, his voice barely a rasp. Naiche. His name. Sarah, she replied, pressing a tin cup of water to his cracked lips. By the 3rd day, he could sit upright. Through halting Spanish and gestures, he told her what she'd already guessed. Militia had ambushed his group during a raid. Not for violence, he insisted, his eyes fierce. Caballos, horses, stolen from his people months ago, now in the hands of white ranchers. He'd been trying to take them back. She didn't ask if he believed that justified the bloodshed. She didn't ask how many men had died. On the frontier, every act of violence had a grievance behind it, and every grievance had a body count. What struck her was the leather pouch he kept clutched against his chest, even in sleep. When she gestured toward it, his hand closed over it protectively. But on the morning of the fourth day, after she'd changed his bandages and brought him cornbread, he opened it. Inside, a tiny moccasin, no longer than her palm, and a lock of black hair tied with sinew. His daughter's. He didn't need to explain. The haunted desperation in his eyes told her everything. He wasn't just fleeing. He was searching. The pounding on the door came at dawn. Sarah Bennett. "Open up, militia business!" She recognized the voice. Callahan, the settlement's self-appointed lawman, a man who wore his authority like a club. 2 deputies flanked him, rifles slung across their backs. Naisha was already moving, silent as smoke, toward the root cellar. Sarah opened the door just wide enough to block their view inside. Callahan's eyes were hard. "We're tracking a wounded Apache. Blood trail leads right to your fence line. We're searching your property." Sarah stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her. "There's no one here, Mr. Callahan, just me." His smile was thin and cold. "Then you won't mind us taking a look." He pushed past her before she could answer, his deputies following. Their boots thundered across her floor, overturning chairs, ripping open cupboards. She stood rigid in the doorway, watching her small sanctuary violated. It took them less than 2 minutes to find the root cellar. Callahan hauled Naiche up by his hair, the warrior's legs buckling beneath him. The bandages Sarah had so carefully wrapped were stark white against his brown skin, damning as a signed confession. Well, Callahan shoved Naiche into the main room, letting him collapse onto the floor. "Looks like the widow's been playing nurse to a murdering savage." "He was dying," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I couldn't let a raider bleed out on your property." Callahan's face flushed red. "You know what he is? What his kind do? They burned the Hutchinson ranch last month, killed the family, took their livestock. And he jabbed a finger at her. "You bandaged him up like he's some kind of wounded lamb." "I don't know what he's done," Sarah said quietly. "I only know what I saw, a dying man at my door." "That's your defense?" Callahan turned to his deputies. "She admits it. Harboring an enemy combatant? That's treason under territorial law." One of the deputies shifted uncomfortably. "Callahan, maybe we should what? Let her walk? She's a squaw sympathizer, Bill. Probably been trading with them for months. That's how she survived out here alone." His voice rose, performing now for an audience beyond the cabin walls. "We hang traitors and raiders both. That's frontier justice." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her. "This isn't justice. This is murder. You should have thought of that before you dragged him inside." They bound both of them, Naiche's hands behind his back, Sarah's in front, and marched them into the settlement as the sun climbed higher. By noon, half the territory had gathered in the square. Callahan made his speech from the steps of the trading post, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Frontier law is clear," he shouted. "Harboring raiders is an act of war against your own people. This woman gave aid and comfort to our enemy. The penalty is exile. For the Apache, hanging at dawn." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded. Others looked away. Then old Samuel Pritchard, head of the settlement council, raised his hand. The crowd quieted. "There's another way," Pritchard said slowly, his weathered face troubled. "According to territorial statute, obscure, rarely used, a white woman who takes responsibility for a native man through marriage places him under her custody. He becomes domesticated, bound by her conduct, silence." Callahan's jaw tightened. "You can't be serious." "It avoids hanging," Pritchard continued, "and it avoids the Apache retaliation that will surely come if we execute one of their warriors on dubious evidence. We don't know what he did. We only know Mrs. Bennett showed him mercy." He looked at Sarah. "If you marry him, you become legally responsible for his actions. He stays under your custody, subject to our laws. You both remain in the territory. The alternative is his death and your exile." "That's insane," Callahan spat. "That's law," Pritchard replied firmly. Sarah stared at the old man, her mind reeling. Marry a stranger who didn't speak her language? Live as his wife under a covenant neither of them chose? But the alternative was his death and her ruin. They were given until sunset to decide. The storage room behind the trading post smelled of burlap and old tobacco. Guards stood outside the locked door. Nietzsche sat against the wall, his breathing still labored. Sarah sat across from him on a grain sack, studying his face in the dim light filtering through the barred window. He met her gaze without flinching. In his eyes she saw the same trapped recognition she felt. 2 lives caught in a snare neither had set. Minutes passed. An hour. Neither spoke. Finally, Nietzsche gestured to himself, then to her, then made a binding motion with his hands. The question was clear even without words. Marriage, Sarah said quietly. Or death, he understood. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his hand drifted to the leather pouch at his belt, the one holding his daughter's moccasin. This forced bond would trap him here, unable to continue searching, but he would be alive. Through the window, the sun descended toward the mountains, bleeding red across the valley. When the guard opened the door at dusk, both of them nodded. The ceremony took place in the settlement square at noon the next day, under a sky so blue it felt like mockery. No flowers, no music. Just Pritchard reading from a leather-bound book while Callahan and his deputies stood behind them, rifles cradled in their arms. The crowd pressed close, miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, their faces a mix of curiosity and contempt. Sarah wore the same dress she'd been arrested in, now stained with dust and sweat. Nietzsche stood beside her, his wounded chest wrapped beneath a borrowed shirt, his hands unbound but his expression carefully blank. Pritchard's voice droned through the vows. Sarah repeated the words like a sleepwalker. When he told Nietzsche to speak, the warrior simply nodded once, a gesture Pritchard accepted as consent. By the authority vested in me by the Colorado Territory, I pronounce you man and wife. No one clapped. Callahan spat into the dirt. They were marched back to Sarah's cabin and locked inside. 2 guards took up positions outside the door, one at the window. The message was clear. This marriage was a leash, not a union. Inside, silence stretched between them like barbed wire. Sarah sat at the table, her hands folded. Nietzsche stood by the window, watching the guards through the gap in the curtain. The knock came an hour later. Sarah opened the door to find Diego Morales, the old Mexican trader who ran the supply post. He held his hat in weathered hands, his face apologetic. "Señora Bennett, perdón, señora." He trailed off, unsure what to call her now. "I hear you need someone who speaks Apache and Spanish both." "I know some. Not much, but some." Sarah stepped aside. "Please, come in." Diego entered slowly, nodding respectfully to Nietzsche. He spoke first in Spanish, then in halting Apache. Nietzsche responded, his voice low and cautious. They went back and forth, Diego translating, building a bridge between 2 people who'd been shackled together without a shared tongue. "He says he is grateful you saved his life," Diego said. "He knows this marriage shames you. He will not burden you with it longer than necessary." "Tell him," Sarah said carefully, "that I don't feel shamed. Just trapped." Diego translated. Nietzsche's eyes flickered to hers, something like understanding passing between them. Then Nietzsche spoke again, longer this time, his hand moving to the leather pouch at his belt. He opened it with reverence and placed the tiny moccasin on the table. "The lock of hair beside it, his daughter," Diego said quietly, "taken 2 years ago. White men raided his village at night, not soldiers but settlers. They took 6 children, sold them." Sarah's breath caught. "Sold them to whom?" Nietzsche reached into the pouch again and pulled out a torn piece of paper, yellowed and stained with travel. He unfolded it carefully and laid it flat on the table. It was a ledger page. A list of names, Apache names Sarah assumed, with ages beside them. 5 years old, 7, 9, and beside each name a price in dollars. At the bottom, a notation. "Delivered to JC Ranch, payment received." And below that, a signature, James Callahan. Sarah's hands went numb. She stared at the paper, the ink seeming to burn into her vision. This can't be. But even as she said it, fragments of memory surfaced. Thomas, in the months before he died, mentioning Callahan's business dealings with a troubled expression. How he'd wanted to speak to Pritchard about something, but the fever took him before he could. She'd thought it was about land disputes or water rights. Not this. Never this. Nietzsche tracked the man's name through traders, Diego continued, translating as the warrior spoke. He followed rumors, bribes, whispers. It led him here. To your territory. The ranch is 2 days north. He came to find it, to find her. But the militia found him first. Nietzsche's voice broke slightly on the last words. Diego didn't need to translate the grief. Sarah picked up the ledger page, her hands trembling. The paper felt obscene, a bill of sale for children. For his daughter. She held the ledger in her trembling hands. Expose Callahan and risk the entire settlement turning violent, or stay silent and live as a lie. What would you do? Her mind raced through the possibilities. Show this to Pritchard? Callahan controlled the militia. Half the men in the settlement owed him favors, feared him, or both. She had no other proof, just a torn piece of paper and the word of an Apache warrior the town already wanted dead. If she spoke, Callahan could claim it was forged, could rally the settlement against her, could kill them both and call it justice, but if she stayed silent, she'd be complicit. She'd be protecting the man who'd stolen children and sold them like livestock, and Nietzsche's daughter would remain lost. What will you do? She asked quietly. Diego translated. Nietzsche responded without hesitation, his eyes locked on hers. He says he leaves at dawn, Diego said. He will go north to the ranch alone. He will not ask you to risk more. You have given him his life, that is enough. He will not trap you further in his fight. Sarah looked at the moccasin so small on her rough-hewn table. She thought of the ceremony in the square, the humiliation designed to break her. She thought of Callahan's sneer, his casual cruelty, and she thought of Thomas, who'd seen something wrong and died before he could make it right. Tell him, Sarah said slowly, that he's not leaving without me. Sarah walked into the settlement square at dawn, the ledger page clutched in her hand, Nietzsche a silent presence at her side. The morning crowd was thin, a few early risers, shopkeepers sweeping stoops, but she didn't need numbers. She needed witnesses. She climbed the steps of the trading post, the same place Callahan had condemned her 2 days before, and raised her voice. I have something to say about James Callahan. Heads turned. Doors opened. Within minutes, a crowd began to gather. Pritchard emerged from the council office, his face puzzled. Callahan himself appeared from the livery, flanked by his deputies, his expression darkening as he saw her. This woman's lost her mind, he called out, striding toward the steps. Get her down from there. This paper, Sarah said, holding the ledger page high, lists the names of 6 Apache children, their ages, and the price James Callahan received for selling them 2 years ago. The crowd went silent. Callahan's laugh was sharp, practiced. Apache lies. You're going to trust a savage's word over mine. She's been living with him. Probably believes whatever story he's fed her. It's his daughter's name on this list, Sarah shot back, taken when she was 6 years old. Sold to something called the J.C. Ranch. Your initials, Mr. Callahan. Your signature at the bottom. Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Callahan's face reddened. That could be forged. Anyone could scribble my name on a piece of paper. Sarah had expected this. Her heart hammered, but her voice stayed steady. Then explain why my husband kept a duplicate record. The crowd stilled. Thomas found your ledger, Sarah continued, the lie becoming truth as she spoke it. He hid his copy in the foundation of our cabin before the fever took him. He was going to bring it to the council, but he died before he could. I found it 3 months ago. I didn't know what it meant until now. It wasn't entirely false. Thomas had hidden papers, deeds, contracts, things he'd said were insurance. She'd never looked closely, never understood their significance. But Callahan didn't know that. The militia leader's jaw worked. You're lying. Then come search my cabin again, Sarah said. Tear up the floorboards. Find the truth. Pritchard stepped forward, his weathered face grave. Mrs. Bennett, these are serious accusations. I know what I'm accusing him of, she said. Child trafficking. 6 children stolen and sold. And I'm asking the council to investigate before more disappear. A woman's voice rose from the crowd. Margaret Henley, a rancher's widow. My niece vanished 2 years ago, traveling with a missionary group. They said Apaches took her, but they never found a body. Her voice cracked. She was 7 years old. Other voices joined hers. Whispers of missing children, unexplained disappearances, rumors no one had dared voice. Callahan's allies began to shift, their expressions uncertain. "This is ridiculous," Callahan snarled. He turned to his deputies. "Arrest her. Arrest them both." Neither deputy moved. Callahan's hand dropped to his pistol. The crowd gasped, drawing back. Sarah stood frozen on the steps, suddenly aware of how exposed she was, how quickly this could end. But Nietzsche moved faster. Despite the wound in his chest, despite 3 days of fever and blood loss, he crossed the space between them in 2 strides. His hand caught Callahan's wrist as the pistol cleared the holster, twisting with precision. The gun clattered to the ground. Callahan swung wildly with his free hand, but Nietzsche sidestepped, swept his legs, and put him face down in the dirt, controlled, efficient, and entirely non-lethal. The crowd stared in stunned silence. Nietzsche stepped back, breathing hard, his hand pressed to his ribs. He didn't pick up the gun. He simply looked at Pritchard and waited. "Madre de Dios," Diego said from the edge of the crowd. He pushed forward, his voice carrying. "I have seen children at a ranch north of here. 2 years ago when I traded there, Apache children working the fields. The rancher said they were wards. I didn't ask questions." His voice dropped with shame. "I should have." Pritchard looked from Diego to Sarah to Nietzsche to Callahan, still struggling in the dirt. The old man's face hardened with resolve. "Council will convene immediately," he announced. "We'll vote on an investigation and a search party." He pointed at Callahan's deputies. "Hold him. He's not going anywhere until we get answers." The vote took less than an hour. 7-1 in favor, Callahan was arrested. A search party of 12 men, including Pritchard and Diego, prepared to ride north at first light. And Sarah and Nietzsche, who 24 hours ago had been prisoners, were now the settlement's unlikely truth-tellers. The marriage, forced upon them as punishment, had become their shield. And the town's complicit silence had finally broken. The search party returned 5 days later with 4 children, 3 boys and 1 girl, thin and silent, blinking in the autumn light like creatures emerging from caves. Nietzsche recognized his daughter instantly. She was 8 now, taller than the moccasin suggested, a scar across her temple that hadn't been there before. When she saw him, she didn't run. She simply stopped, her eyes filling with tears she wouldn't let fall. He knelt in the dust, and she walked into his arms. The settlement gathered that evening, not for judgment this time, but for something closer to atonement. Pritchard offered safe passage and supplies. Others brought food, blankets, a repaired saddle. Diego led forward a sturdy mare, its reins wrapped in red cloth. "For the road," the old trader said quietly. "Wherever it takes you." Sarah and Nietzsche stood side by side, his daughter between them. The marriage certificate still existed, legally binding, but something had shifted. They were no longer prisoners of the law's cruelty. They were allies who'd chosen to stand together when standing alone meant death. "We'll head west," Sarah said. "Start over." Nietzsche nodded. His daughter's hand slipped into Sarah's. 3 years later, the way station sat at a crossroads 40 miles west of the settlement. A sturdy cabin with a barn, a well, and a sign that read Bennett and Nietzsche, all welcome. Travelers of every kind stopped there, miners, traders, missionaries, Apache families moving between territories. Sarah taught reading to frontier children at a long wooden table. Nietzsche's daughter, now 11 and fluent in 3 languages, helped with lessons and tended the horses with quiet confidence. On the mantel above the hearth sat 2 artifacts, side by side, a small leather pouch containing a child's moccasin, and a torn ledger page, faded but preserved. Reminders of a bond forged in coercion that had become, against all odds, a chosen family. Their story began with a lie the law forced them to live. But what happened when the law came for them again? Watch the next story to see how far they'd go to protect the life they'd built.